Welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today we welcome public historian and ethnographer Marion Cohen. She will be talking today about how enslaved people preserved food during the 18th century and how they provided for their families during the winter. Please leave any questions that you have for our speaker in the comments, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Welcome. Let me ask a question first before we start. Have you ever been in a situation where you're waiting for the snow to fall and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm out of milk, I'm out of toilet paper, I need to run to Walmart or I need to run to some store and get provisions? Well, we can do that in this day, but in the 18th century, it wasn't so easy. You had to really think about what you were going to do to have food in the winter. So what I want to talk today about is about the enslaved community and how they preserve their food for the winter months. So really preserving the food for the winter months doesn't start when the weather gets cold. It doesn't start in September or October, November. It starts way before then. It starts when you're first putting the seeds in the ground in spring, in summer, with the thought process that, oh, I've got to make enough so I can get through the winter. So let's start first with the foundation of food, or what they call the enslaved rations, that would have been given to each slave per week. So these are the rations that, say, a Thomas Jefferson or a George Washington would have given their enslaved community per week per slave. That would have been a pound of fatback, and the fatback is the fat part of the hog, and then the top portion is the skin of the hog, and all that white stuff that's around there, that's salt. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the salting. This pork, they call it fatback, or they also call it salted pork, because you can see that all the salt is there. The other thing that they were given was 4 cups of cornmeal. Now, actually, this is true. This was ground at the grist mill at Mount Vernon, so this is exactly how it would look. And Thomas Jefferson and George Washington would have given their slaves 4 cups of this per week per slave. There again, and a pound of fatback. And then they also gave them some fish. This is salted herring. Salted herring comes in different sizes, some small, some are little. This almost looks like anchovies, but it's really salted herring. So that was the basis of the food that was given to the enslaved community all year long, whether it was spring, summer, fall, winter, that's what they're getting. That's not enough food, though. Even if you're talking about the winter time, it's not enough food. So what did they do to bring more food to the table? What did the moms and dads do to be able to take care of their family during the winter months? Well, in the summer, or the spring and the summer, the enslaved community would work from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. So here at Monticello or Mount Vernon or wherever you were enslaved, you worked from can to can't, as they said. Can't work because the sun's come up, can work because the sun's gone down. Can work because the sun's gone up, can't work because the sun's gone down. So in the summer, that could be anywhere from, 6 o'clock in the morning until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Then you come back to your cabin, and this is where you have to start to really do the things that you need to prepare yourself to go into the winter months. And what you do is, most slave owners allowed their enslaved community to have their own slave gardens. And those gardens were near their cabins, and they would have seeds, and they would grow their own vegetables and different things, so that would get them through the winter months. So what kind of things would they grow in their gardens? Well, you got to remember, they're going to grow things that they know that they can preserve. So the 3 ways that people preserved things in the 18th century was drying, was salting, or pickling. So we're going to basically talk about the drying and the salting as a method of preserving food that the enslaved community would have had for the winter. So remember, they're putting things into the ground that they know that when they harvest, they can then use for the winter months. So some of the things, sweet potatoes. These are yams from Ghana. Other things would have been turnip. They would have made lots of beans like black-eyed peas, fava beans, peanuts. They would have done some herbs. I've got some rosemary and thyme and sage in here, pumpkins, squash, sesame seeds. All of those things they would have grown in their garden. Now, why would they grow these things, these specific things in their garden? Well, it's simple. Like I said, they're easy to preserve. They're easy to carry you into the 3 or 4 months of winter when you can't go out in the forest and forage for berries and nuts or watercress, which were greens that grew out in the woods. So you've got to be able to get the provisions ready for winter. So if you grew sweet potatoes, you harvest those. And it's an interesting thing that the enslaved community knew that, and a lot of whites, poor whites, knew that using the ground as a way to keep or preserve food was a good way to do it. So the enslaved community would have dug a hole in their cabin, and they would have gotten into the dirt, into the dirt in their cabin, and they would have stored precious things in what they call a root cellar. And they would put a board or whatever on top of it. And that would be a place that they would keep very special objects, things that were important to them. So some of the things that were important to them were sweet potatoes, because this is something that's going to keep you through the winter months. Also, turnips. You get these, you can cut all this up and put into a stew. We have the black-eyed peas. Now, black-eyed peas, when they're harvested, and if they're kept in a dry place, they'll stay good for a year. So think about it. That's going to keep you through the winter months, having something like black-eyed peas. Now it's a staple. It's Southern food, definitely. I know that my family, being African-American, every New Year's, you got to eat your black-eyed peas so you can have luck in the rest of the year. So this is some of the beans that they grew. Also, they grew fava beans. And I have one here, and you open it up, and you see this bean is pretty big. And so one of the ways that they preserved the fava beans was to let it dry out. Just like with the black-eyed peas, if you keep it away from moisture, it will last a very long time. Also, other beans would have been lima beans. There was a lot of lima beans grown by the African-American community that was enslaved. The other thing, and this is what I find just absolutely fascinating, they would grow a lot of cabbage. And if you were to grow cabbage and harvest it right before the first frost, so maybe before October, late October, first part of November. So you harvest this cabbage. You take all the surrounding leaves that are kind of sprouting out. So you have a nice head of cabbage like this. Usually you're going to have a stem on it. We've cut the stem off, but usually you're going to have a stem on it. So how are you going to preserve cabbage to last you until the winter months are over? Well, what they did was they would dig a hole, and they would put the cabbage in the hole and have the stem out and pack very tightly the dirt around the stem. And keeping this cabbage in that hole, wrapped with all of that wonderful soil and the stem hanging out, is a good way to preserve it. As long as you can keep the moisture out, if you had something like sand or sawdust, that's even a good thing to keep the moisture out. Keeping the moisture out helped to preserve things through the winter. So when they were ready to eat something, they just took the stem, popped the cabbage out of the ground, cut it up, and used it. Another way that they preserve the cabbage is just to slice it up real thin, almost like you're doing little strips of vegetables. So you just cut it up really, really small. And then you set it out and you let the sun dry it. And so the sun would dry it, and then you would put it up into a a container, something like this, earthenware, and keep it in there. As long as you kept it dry and kept moisture out of it, you could use it. And then when you're ready to use it, you would just put those cabbage strips into your pot, and you could make a soup or stew or something like that. The other interesting things about what was grown in the enslaved garden were a lot of things that came from Africa. We know that okra came from Africa. We know black-eyed peas came from Africa. We know that sesame seed came from Africa. And the culture within the African American community, the enslaved community, was one of communal living. It was a little for one makes a lot for all. A little for one makes a lot for all. So if all you have in your garden is X, Y, and Z, and your neighbor has in his garden ABC, and you put those all together in communal living, then they all have enough to get through the winter. So these are the things that they're growing to make sure that they have enough to get them through the cold, cold months. The other thing that they did with the squash, they grew a lot of squash in their gardens, because squash you can really preserve a lot. There's two kinds of squash. There's the spring squash, which is usually your bottleneck squash. You see it, it's yellowish. And then there's the winter squash, which I don't have one here, but it's called cushaw. And it almost looks like a watermelon on the bottom and has a neck on top like a bottleneck, a crook neck squash. That cushaw, when they would grow that in that garden, was a staple for them, because cushaw has thicker skin than your spring squash. So that winter squash, once harvested, could be cut up and used in different stews, soups, and things of that nature. And the thing is about the cushaw, if you cut a little bit out of it, you didn't really have to worry about it spoiling. There's something about the cushaw that it doesn't spoil even though you cut it. It takes longer for it to spoil. So growing things like squash was real important in the enslaved community garden for winter. Another way that they preserved, remember we talked about drying? Well, here I have cut some of my summer squash and I've hung it from twine, and I've got a little branch here, and that's how I strung it. I took the string and pushed it through with the branch. And if I wanted to dry this, I would hang it near the fire, near the mantle, and just let it dry out. And when I was ready to use it, say I'm going to make a stew or a soup, I would just throw this back into the water. It would reconstitute, and then I could have a meal. It's the same thing that we use with our dehydrators now for food, but this is the way that they would have done it in the 18th century. The other thing about the enslaved community and their food way is really one-pot cooking. It's African culture to make one pot. Everybody comes around and enjoy that pot, whether it's soup or stew. So having all these vegetables, and in the winter, you've got your cabbage that you put in the ground. You've got your squash that you have dried. You have your fatback. All of those things can be put into a pot, one pot, and cooked, and then you have a meal. Remember, a little for some is a lot for all. So they really had to think ahead. They did think ahead, and they were able to make enough food to last them for the 3 or 4 months of the winter time. The other thing that the men and boys would do, especially in the spring and summer, they would go into the woods and they would trap and snare small game, rabbits, squirrels, possums, and even in the winter, the best meat to get would have been the possum. Because if you got a possum, possums during the winter are really fat because they fattened up for the weather. So if you could get a possum to put in your pot, that was really a good thing. The other thing that the men and boys did is they would go fishing. And so they would go down to places like the Rivanna River or the Potomac River or wherever you're enslaved, and they would fish. Well, in the spring and summer, you could just have the fish. But in the winter, how are you going to store that fish so you can use it during those lean months? Well, one of the ways, there again, drying, you could gut a fish, let it set near the fire, and just let it dry out. Let the sun dry out, let the fire dry it out. And there again, this will last you for a long time. When you're ready to use it, you just cut it up, put it in your pot with all your other vegetables, and then you have a meal for your family. So all of these things were really important to the 18th century African American that was enslaved. Because like I said, you couldn't go to Walmart, you couldn't go down the street to your grocery store. You had to be able to think ahead about the things that you could put into your root cellar, which is that hole that they would dig in the bottom of their cabins and put boards over to keep very special things safe, or digging a hole with your cabbage. The other thing is that winter did provide some refrigeration. If you think about it, when it snows, guess what? If you melt snow, there's water. If you put something in the snow, in a snowbank, it's going to keep it cool and keep it longer. So it's all of those things that you're thinking about, your drying, your salting, and your pickling. Now, I don't see a whole lot of references to African American enslavement, enslaved persons using pickling. They could have, if they had vinegar or had access to that. But the main methods were really going to be your drying and your salting. So let's get back to the salt here with this salt pork. Pork in the 18th century was really important, whether you were enslaved or whether you were a Thomas Jefferson. So when the months start to get cool, say October, well into December, you would have hog killing time. And the enslaved men would do the hog killing. And this is the time when they would get the hams and they would put them in the smokehouse, there again, smoking it. And that would be part of the provisions for Thomas Jefferson and his family. It was a sign of wealth for gentry if they could have a ham on their table every day. So for the enslaved community, they would be given the lesser cuts. So they would be given things like chitlins, which are the intestines of the hog, or they would, as their ration, they would get a pound of salted pork each week. So how you salt this? Well, I did this last night, and I used my jar here, but usually they would have big wooden barrels, and they would fill the bottom of the barrel with salt. Then they would pack this pork, this fatback or salted pork into the bottom of the keg, and then have that filled there, put some more salt on top of that, put some more meat on top of that, and just keep layering it until you got to the top. Before then, they would have also boiled a little bit of water with salt in it to make a brine. And they would take that brine and they would pour the brine on top of the pork that you've already salted and put a lid on it and make sure it was tight. That would keep this salted pork well into the winter to be able to give to your enslaved community. So with this salted pork was a good way to salt your meat, your vegetables if you're making a stew or you're making a soup, but there is a lot of salt in here. So you are going to, in some cases, you may put it in water and try to get some of the salt off of it. You could use it the way it is now, but if you get some of that salt off, it's better. And you can see the salt that's on my hand. But salting is definitely a good way to preserve your pork. The other reason that pork was good is because it's easier to preserve than if you try to preserve beef. So salting and preserving your pork and using that to feed to your enslaved community was, in their minds, an efficient way to give rations to the enslaved community. But if you look at the rations that we have here, it really isn't enough. So it's good that they also could go and then raise in their garden vegetables and things that they could put in one pot and cook. One of the things that they did with their cornmeal is they would take the cornmeal and have some hot water, and they would mix it up. And it's almost like making cornbread that we like, minus sugar, the salt, and the taste. Then you'd have what we call an ash cake or a hoe cake. Here's a hoe blade, a broad hoe. So in the fields, when the enslaved community are working and it's time to take their midday fare, they could take some of this cornmeal made into a dough and use this broad hoe to be able to cook their hoe cake on top of it. So the dough goes on the hoe cake, hoe blade, ashes go on top of the dough, and then you have an ash cake or a hoe cake. So if you make this in your hearth in your house or in your cabin, then they call it ash cake, but it's really the same thing. This would have been a staple of the enslaved community. Remember, I'm saying they're doing a lot of stews, they're doing a lot of soups. So with this ash cake or hoe cake, you just dip it into that juice. And in my day, because I'm African American, we called it pot liquor. And so I like to tell people pot liquor is the only thing you can drink and then you can drive because it's not going to get you in any problems. But you take this hoe cake or ash cake and you dip it in there and you just sop all that juice up, and then you have something that goes along with your meal. As far as the salted herring goes, chop that up again, put it into your stew. So all the things that you see here, plus more, could have been put into a pot and preserved for the winter months. This could get you well into spring, and then you start the process all again. Because some of the food you have taken, like this is a long pie pumpkin, and you let it go to seed like this one, and then you get the seeds out, you dry the seeds, and then you use it to grow more vegetables in the spring. In some cases, though, you just let it dry and then you eat it, or you put it over in a pan and just let it roast, and then you can eat it, just like you can with the peanuts. You can either eat the peanuts raw, or you can shell them and put them near the fire and let them get a little toasty, and that would be a meal for you. The last thing I want to talk about is the sesame seeds. I love talking about sesame seeds because everybody, well, not everybody, but I have gone to McDonald's and you get the hamburger that has the sesame seeds on it, right? People don't realize that sesame seeds came from Africa. It came over with the Atlantic slave trade. So it's a wonderful product to grow because it also helps to thicken up your stews, thicken up your soups. So it's really an agent that's very good to just make things feel warm and good. And the other part of all of this is the enslaved community lived in a world where they had few choices. They were told where to live. They were told what tasks they were going to do. In their own garden, they could grow what they want. So that gave them some anonymity. But also there is this sense of coming together communally and eating, breaking bread. We still do that today. In Thanksgiving, Christmas, we come together, we break bread and celebrate. And I would think that it would be the same thing, whether it was spring, summer, fall, or winter, the enslaved community coming together and celebrating small things, a birth, someone jumping the broom, or doing some things that would bring a little happiness into their life. So I know that food in my family, basically a lot of these things I grow in my garden too, and put it all in one pot and cook it. And then I know that when I was growing up was segregation, so we couldn't just go to any diner. We would go to grandma's house. So everybody would have a communal dinner at grandma's house. It's basically the same thing in the 18th century. But you have to make sure that you have enough food to get you through the winter. And that's why they use this process of drying and salting and pickling to keep enough food fresh until they came into spring and they could start growing more crops and things. So are there any questions?
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. We do have a few questions from some of the people that are watching our live stream. The first one is from Bridget, and she asks if preserving some foods took precedence over others. Maybe are some foods more important to have on hand when you're thinking about preserving foods for the winter time?
Bridget, that's an excellent, excellent question. You know, they're always going to get their salted pork. And this really is a staple because this is the seasoning that's really going to be put into the pot in the stews or the soups that's going to help you get through the winter. But they're also getting this in the spring and summer. So they know they're going to get this. The beans and the cabbage, all of those things were really important because you could preserve them and they would stay good so long. Like I said, black-eyed peas, you know, nothing to keep this for a year if you keep it, you know, in a dry place and moisture doesn't get to it. The cabbage is always good because if you put it in the hole and have it secure and there's no moisture getting in there, it's going to make for a good soup. So the vegetables and beans were really the main things that they were growing because they could preserve them very well.
We also have a question from Rochelle, and she's wondering how they prevented bugs from eating the stored food.
Well, you know, if you had things like jars like this, you could always put cloth over top of it. If you had leather, you could put leather over top of it. I mean, if you put your beans in jars that had cloth or leather tops to go over it, those things can keep the insects and bugs and so forth out. Some are still going to get in, but you know, you do what you have to do.
And then we had one other question that's kind of interesting. Actually, we've got a couple more. They keep coming in. So let me let me ask this one from Kevin. He's asking if the cost of salt determined how food was preserved, and was pickling less expensive? Like, was that a consideration?
You know, salt is something that Thomas Jefferson is going to buy. Then you have the vinegar. In my opinion, the salt would have been probably the cheaper way to go. And sometimes the vinegar can have a little bitter taste to it, more so than if you put salt. So salt was a preferred way because then you can salt pork salt pork for your enslaved community, not necessarily for the beef for Thomas Jefferson, but it was an easier way to preserve food for the enslaved community versus doing pickling, because you're not going to give your enslaved pickled eggs or pickled anything. It's going to be the salt.
We have a question from Anne, wondering if the ash cake tasted good or was it gritty from the ashes?
Well, it's like cornbread minus the sugar, the salt, and the taste. But and actually, I've tasted it. What they would do is try to get as much ash off it as you can. But you know, now we know that charcoal is good for us. I mean, we're brushing our teeth with charcoal. They did that in the 18th century, and now it's coming back full circle. We're doing it now. So having ash on there really wouldn't have bothered them because they're dipping it into their soup or their stews, and it's loosening it up, and so it's going to have a good taste.
Okay, here is another question from a viewer asking if enslaved people ever pushed for more rations from their owners.
That's an interesting question too. You can't say all slaves did this or all slaves did that. You have to be very general in your approach because slavery and how the enslaved community was treated was based regionally. So we're in the upper South. So we're growing things like grain and wheat and corn. We're doing sheep, things like that, versus when you get into the lower South, especially after the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, they're growing more sugarcane, cotton, and that's just a tremendous strain on your body and your spirit and your soul. So slavery is very regional in what you do. There are times that I have read, I don't know about Monticello here, but I have read where enslaved community did say, hey, this isn't enough, we need a little bit more. So there are historical documents that said the owners gave their enslaved community, instead of a pound of fat back, they gave them 3 pounds of fat back. At Christmas time, sometimes they got rum. Sometimes they would get a better cut of the hog. It really was on the preference of whoever owned them. Being enslaved was your property. And so it was the owner that decided what he wanted to do. But certainly the African-American community, the enslaved community, wanted agency. They wanted their own lives. And so if they could do resistance by breaking their tools so they didn't have to go to work, who wants to work for free, right? Or wanting to get more food allocated, certainly if they thought they could get it, they would do it. Yes, it's all about self-preservation.
A couple more questions here. Charles is wondering if they had butter that they could use.
In the African-American community, if you're enslaved, you're not going to have butter. Let me take that back. In the majority, you're not going to have butter because, like I said, you can't say never. I've not seen where they used it. What they would use is they would take their fat back or their salted pork and they would render it down, meaning they would boil it down. And that rendered fat is what we call lard today. And they would use lard to fry chicken or fry fish or whatever it is that they wanted to use. So their substitute for butter would have been probably the lard that they would have rendered down from their salted pork.
So there was a question that's kind of related to that about cheese. Was cheese available to enslaved people?
Not. If an owner wanted to give their enslaved community some cheese, but that's not going to be part of their ration, that's not going to be something that the enslaved community are making for themselves. They're more of the vegetable because they can grow it in their own garden and going out and trapping and snaring small game. The enslaved community's diet too was more on a vegetarian basis as opposed to, or just opposed to using meat. So growing these things were really part of their historical narrative, and it's what they did.
Okay, one more question from Karen asking if they could store poultry for long-term use. Is there a lot of poultry?
You can store anything in the snow. So if there's snow, yes, you could store things. But meat like poultry, possum, you're really going to use that within 2 or 3 days of killing it or catching it. You're not going to try to, dry it or salt it or anything. You're going to use that as soon as you get it. But certainly you can put something in the snow and it's going to last longer than if you just keep it out in the open.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we had. We had a whole bunch coming in there at the end. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with?
I just would like to leave you with the fact that what I've talked to you today about are many things that I grew up with. Growing up with a grandmother who talked to me about her grandmother being enslaved and using the one pot and growing her own vegetables and throwing them into a pot and having a communal dinner is part of my family's history, being African American. So it is so important to me to be able to come out, especially to a place like Monticello, and talk to you all about the food waste, talk to you about the gardens, and talk about the food and how the enslaved community was creative enough to make sure that they could sustain themselves and their family through the winter months.
Thank you so much for being
Thank
here
you.
with us today. We really appreciate it. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for everyone viewing from home. Join us again next week for another Monticello live stream.
Thank you.